Sup y'all, and welcome to the Geography of Industry and Services, Part 4. In this video, we're going to investigate the global division of labor by asking this essential question: how has the geography of production changed since the mid-20th century? To best understand how trade, production, and globalization has changed over the past half-century, we need to first recap what occurred before. According to most economists, historians, and geographers, there have been two major waves of globalization. As we studied previously, the first truly global empire was Portugal, because they were the first to connect colonies around the globe through maritime trade. However, the pace of this international trade remained relatively small until what is called the first wave of globalization, which began toward the end of the First Industrial Revolution from around 1840 until 1914. This had an intranational effect. For example, in the United States, canals and then railways greatly reduced transport costs, leading to greater economic integration. For comparison, in 1850, ships carried 6 times the freight of railroads. By 1890, railroads carried 5 times the freight of ships. However, globalization took off primarily through steamships, which reduced international transport costs while increasing speed and reliability. These transport costs fell enough to make large-scale trade possible between places based on their comparative advantage. So trade increased the greatest between distant and dissimilar countries, those with different climates and natural resources. For example, Britain traded manufactured goods for Indian tea, Argentine beef, and Australian wool. Widespread reductions in tariff barriers also led to a massive increase in trade, as well as migration streams. 60 million people migrated from Europe to places like North America and Australia to work on newly available land. The first wave of globalization retreated and came to an end after 1914, and even though transport technology continued to improve, trade policy went into full reverse. World War I and the Great Depression greatly reduced the demand for many goods, and countries increased tariffs in a vain attempt to bolster their domestic markets. The retreat into nationalism produced anti-immigrant sentiment, and restrictions led to the decline of immigration. The second wave of globalization began at the end of World War II in 1945 and has continued to this day. The United Nations was founded in that same year, and the impetus of internationalism persuaded governments to increase cooperation and reduce trade barriers. From 1950 to the late 1970s, sea freight charges fell by a third, and the combination of lower tariffs along with reduced transport cost led to the Fordist Era, where agglomeration and economies of scale led to massive savings and increases in profits. In the landmark book The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith contended the division of labor is limited only by the extent of the market. And it was in the 1970s that a convergence of transport and communication technologies, combined with the emergence of new labor pools in the developing world, that a post-Fordist era emerged with an emphasis on economies of scope, in which efficiency is formed through variety, not volume. This will be explained further. However, the second wave of globalization has led to a new international division of labor. Keep in mind, the Green Revolution had its beginnings in 1940, and with it, developing countries such as China, Mexico, and India went from food-poor to food-rich nations, enabling them to begin large-scale industrialization. Containerization had its start in the 1950s. For comparison, in 1956, the loading of loose cargo cost just under $6 a ton. When containers were introduced in that year, the loading cost was less than 16 cents a ton. Now let's look even more closely at the year that truly marked the beginning of the Post-Fordist Era, 1973. Look at some of the technologies that were invented in this year. The first personal computer, the Alto, was developed by Xerox in 1973. Have you ever seen Ethernet cable? It was also invented at Xerox, allowing for local area networking between computers. Fiber optic cable was invented in 1973, allowing for more information to be sent further and at lower cost than old copper cables. The first cell phone was invented by an executive at Motorola. This handheld device was aptly nicknamed the Brick, weighing in at almost 2.5 pounds. And who knew that the internet was basically invented in 1973? The means of breaking down and transmitting digital data across networks was worked out by engineers at the US Department of Defense and became the industry standard a decade later. Other major innovations included Universal Product Codes, or UPC symbols, invented by IBM, enabling instant and reliable transactions. Genetic engineering through recombinant DNA was invented, making the gene revolution possible. And Skylab, the first space station, was launched by NASA, providing a wealth of scientific knowledge over its short lifespan. And last but not least, I was born. Now, this is not a complete list, but while most of these innovations were truly revolutionary, they took time to take hold. And as is the case with most revolutions, it would take a spark to actually propel the world into a new era. In October of that year, the Arab-Israeli War broke out when a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel to gain lost land. This occurred during the time of Yom Kippur and Ramadan. The United States supplied Israel with arms, and as a result, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, enacted an oil embargo against the US and other Israeli supporters, essentially most Western democracies, such as the UK. Prices quadrupled in half a year, from around $3 to $12 a barrel. Israel quickly gained the edge and negotiated a ceasefire. Nonetheless, a worldwide energy crisis ensued. This energy shock, along with large and cheap labor pools in newly industrialized countries, combined with dramatic improvements in transport and communication technology, led to a new international division of labor, also known as the Global Division of Labor. Freight costs have been cut in half since the mid-1970s, driven by investments in transport infrastructure such as seaports, better capacity use through containerization, technological progress in areas like telecommunications, and also through lower tariffs. Just look at the impact of containerization. Once the infrastructure facilities were in place, container traffic took off. However, running counter to conventional wisdom, the friction of distance resulting from transport costs has surprisingly actually remained fairly constant. For example, the price of transporting $1's worth of coal has really not fallen much since the 1950s. The main savings have come from lower intermodal transfer costs. Containerization allowed goods to be packed only once and shipped over long distances using maritime, rail, and road transport. With the arrival of the jet engine, air transport costs came down quickly in the post-World War II era. Between 1955 and 2004, adjusting for inflation with $2015, air freight prices fell from $3.30 per ton mile to around 25 cents. New information and communication technologies, many of which were introduced in the 1970s, as stated before, mean it is easier to manage and control geographically dispersed supply chains. Again, adjusting for inflation using $2015, the cost of a 3-minute phone call from New York to London fell from $480 in 1931 to just over $1 in 2001 for a much better connection, and to just a few cents today. What is most different about the Post-Fordist era is that transport and communication costs fell low enough that small differences in products and tastes fueled trade between similar countries, specifically in Europe and North America. Again, this relates to economies of scope. Neighbors trade different types of beer and different parts of cars, such as wheels and tires. Trading components and parts have grown to take advantage of specialization and economies of scale. What is actually quite fascinating and counterintuitive is that the new international division of labor has increased trade among countries that are closer to each other at a much greater rate than those that are further away. And this can best be explained through, not geography.
Yes, well!
To be more precise, as transport costs fall, physical geography matters less. But with economies of scale in production, economic geography matters more. Basically, we can look to psychology to better understand the human patterns of modern globalization. The growing demand for varieties of similar goods helps explain the paradox that falling transport costs have led to more trade between countries that are close by and have similar characteristics. Once a region starts to become specialized, infrastructure that facilitates the industry, or industries, build within and around it, and this makes the area more efficient. People and businesses agglomerate in that region, resulting in even more specialization and intra-industry trade where they can take advantage of local place characteristics. For instance, the location of inexpensive manufacturing of components in peripheral and semi-peripheral locations where abundant, cheap, and unskilled labor can be found. Compare that with the location of research and development, concentrated in core countries with better educated and skilled labor. And most of these countries are generally in relatively close proximity to each other. Such is the case with the United States trading heavily with Canada and Mexico. Even China, our #1 trading partner, is close in terms of relative distance, since maritime transport is so cheap and efficient. So the first wave of globalization was characterized by conventional inter-industry trade that exploited differences in natural environments that were usually distant from each other. Weber's traditional trade theory focused almost solely on transport cost, and that worked for his time. But his theory did not attribute enough value for the changes of the second wave of globalization, governed by a new international trade. Driven by economies of scale through specialization and agglomeration, and economies of scope through product differentiation, with intra-industry trade between countries that are relatively close to each other. In actuality, once regions were saturated with enough goods from different places and cost differences were minimized, people increasingly wanted more varieties of similar goods. Initially, in the first wave of globalization, countries traded because they could not produce the imported products themselves. For instance, trading engines for bananas. In the old trade theory and with relatively high transport costs, countries traded only what they needed to. In the new trade theory, under the second wave of globalization, driven by scale economies, a desire for variety, and low transport costs, countries trade because they want to. We want slightly different versions of similar goods, as in the case with smartphones offered by Apple, Nokia, Samsung, Sony, and others. And this explains the modern global division of labor.
Well, la-di